Greetings, YouTube. Today I'll be looking at the HARP supplement Folkways. I received this as a free review copy, just so that you all know. Now, this product comes from an anthropological point of view, which I don't think I've ever encountered in a gaming product before. I've seen things discussing historical points of view, for like example, breaking down the economic structures of the Middle Ages in Europe. Or doing a setting set in the Aztec era, or things like that. But this is ambitious. And when I read the author's notes dealing with this, I'm like, to my mind, this took a lot of guts to do. Because you either succeed because you've done something I don't think I've ever seen before, or you're going to fall flat on your face. So we're going to see which one happened. So the author, my apologies, I didn't have that queued up, the author's name. The author is Jonathan Casey. So I'm actually going to use the author's notes himself to give a brief description of what each of the folkways he's discussing entails. And there's 20 of them. There's environmental ways. How does your culture respond to, get shaped by, understand, anthropomorphize, and live in the physical environment? Urban ways. How does your culture build villages, towns, and cities? Folkways. How does your culture structure and support families and households, and what is the difference between the reality and the ideal? Marriage ways. How does your culture define the courtship rituals, the marriage bond, and divorce? Lifespan ways. How does your culture treat children, adolescents, adults, and the age? Gender and sexuality. How does your culture define gender and maintain gender roles? How do men and women relate to each other? What sexual practices are normative? Association ways. How does your culture govern patterns of friendship, kinship, clan, fraternal organizations, affiliations, and settlement? Rank ways. How does your culture assign rank between members of the society? What do the different roles entitle the holder to, and what are the relationships between these ranks? Order ways. How does your culture define the orderly and disorderly? How does it maintain orderliness and punish disorderliness? What is the ordering institutions within the society? Authority ways. How does your culture define power, authority, and political participation? Freedom ways. How does your culture define the liberty, freedom, restraint, and libertarian customs and institutions? Wealth ways. How does your culture feel about the wealthy, and the poor, and how does it distribute its wealth? Work ways. What does your culture value about work and its nature? What is the work ethic? Leisure ways. How does your culture define leisure? Does it value it? What do your people do to kick back, provided they have the means to? Dress ways. How do your members of your culture dress and adorn themselves? Food ways. What do the members of your culture eat, and how do they cook? Language ways. How does your culture use language and names? Magic ways. How does your culture understand, shape, control, teach, and use magic? Does it have a positive or negative relationship with magic? Supernatural ways. How does your culture understand the relationship between which cannot be seen and that which can? Does the culture engage in religious practices? If so, how and what are they? Self-reflection ways. What does your culture refuse to be honest with itself? What are its secrets and shames? And that right there told me which side of that divide I just described this product was going to fall onto. That this was going to go in a direction that was going to be profoundly important. Because this isn't just a description of a snapshot of a culture, like a tour guide. This is breaking down the positives and the negatives, and it's also what is the culture in question lying to itself about. And that is really powerful stuff. I'm going to zip up here to the table of contents and kind of use it as my notes. So we have the author's notes, some of which I just read. Then we go into chapter 2, field notes from the 20th and 21st century. Fantasy. So the author uses this structure, those 20 folkways, to discuss some famous fantasy settings. You discuss The Middle-earth by Tolkien, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun, Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogies, Donaldson's Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, The World of Warcraft, and HARP itself. So you have, okay, this is what my product's going to do. This is how it would be used if you were going to describe these other famous fantasy cultures that you will have almost for. I knew most of these. I'd never heard of the Farsi or trilogies, but I'm familiar with all the rest, at least in understanding a rough idea about them. Then it gets into like a 25 or 27 page section that breaks down how you ask yourself the questions to fill in these blanks on those 20 folkways. And each one has a wonderful chart structure when they get around to doing the case studies in these two um, HARP specific cultures. One is the Grix and one is the Gnome. And each one gets like, it's a nice little chart that gives 4 different elements from each of the folkways. So the level of detail is high, okay? Almost daunting. It really is. Interestingly, so it deals with the Commonwealth of Erin, Erix, Erin, Enrix, sorry, Enrix, yeah, the Grix. They'll have too many Y's and X's in there. And the gnomes culture being described is the Elysian Mormoops, which is ridiculously fun to say. Mormoopians. Kudos for that one. And I don't remember if it ever clicked in my head, but gnomes in the HARP universe are genderless. They choose which gender they want to be when it comes to breeding time. So anyone could become a biological male, anyone can become a biological female, and most gnomes have 2 kids, both on one on each side of that process in their lives, which was fascinating. But it did make me wonder, well, how is bodily waste handled when they're not specific? What did the gender neutral biological functions look like? I know that's a little touchier than some people might want. Also, there's no sex drive amongst gnomes. There's no masturbation. There's no recreational entertainment. They put all of their efforts into their pursuits of interest. That was quite fascinating. Then the author puts out 11 new races, most of which are variations of a fusion between human and some kind of either element or animal. And these have a smaller, more of a thumbnail description of them. It's much less detailed. Each does have a picture of the race. In fact, this is the kind of description that, for the most part, unless a book is dedicated to a race, this is closer to what I've seen in the past with other descriptions of races, just to give the player character an idea of what they're going to be coming from, or an NPC for the GM. And they emphasize one of the 20 folkways for each of these races. So it's not exactly the same for each one. So the type of, it basically saying this is the most important folkway for this particular race. Now I have no fault with the artwork. It's adequate. But when it came to the fusion of human and animals, these are anthropomorphic races. I prefer my anthropomorphic races to be much more animal-like. And I know this is utterly subjective. But I don't really love the Egyptian concept of a human body with an animal head. I mean, that's how the Egyptians want to do it. You know, that's fine. But I prefer my races that are anthropomorphic animals to be far more animal-like, to be humanoid animals, not just a human with a mask, essentially. And a lot of in the illustrations in here, that is very much what came across. That's a very minor quibble, and it was easy to reskin, literally reskin, these races. But that was my one thing. I'm looking at this going, I'm not feeling it. I'm reading the description, and I'm thinking that the description would be better served with an art that was closer to more of an animal-like nature. But that's just me. Then he introduces some new cultures: aquatic, aerial, Arctic, borderlands, coastal, and deeping. Now, deeping isn't interesting. Deeping isn't just subterranean cultures. Like there are some gnomes in like classic Pathfinder and D&D, and some dwarves that live underground. Deeping goes below that. Deeping isn't even drow, or drow, depends on how you pronounce it. Deeping goes further. Those are the races that are so far down that they may not even be aware that there are surface races, that there is a surface. And that was fascinating to me. Then they introduced some new professions. Uh, the artisan, athlete, hunter, intellectual, laborer, sailor, scoundrel, seeker, trader, and valet, and some new talents. I believe it was under the talent section, or the new training packages. Yeah, I think that's what it was. They had the clown, which is terrifying to me. It's just not a big clown fan. And I'm like, wow, that could be really warped if you mix that with the right kind of a class or skill set. That could be creepy. But it's interesting, and I appreciate that. Then they break down some cultures of Cyrodiil and Shadow World using the 20 folkways that has been discussed in this product. Cyrodiil, the theocracy of Asut and the Orsai Empire, and Shadow Worlds, the Vasai Republic, Lydians, and Ochu, folkways of the Vasai Republic. Now, I have to say that I found the Vasai Republic to be more interesting to me because it is more fantasy worldish to me. The theocracy of Asut and the Orsai Empire, to me, is just a reskinning of far too many patriarchal theocracies that exist in the real world. And I'm just like, oh, look at more horrible theocratic oppression of minorities and women and magic use. And I have no fault with how the author did it. He performed admirably, completely and utterly presented a believable culture, too believable because we see it in the real world. I just personally, it made me think, I want to live, I want to create a fantasy setting that has no patriarchal structures, that there is nothing related to our world whatsoever, where there is no sexism and misogyny and racism. That would be really refreshing. Then we get into chapter 9, which is appendix charts, and the charts are cool because you can roll up random traits for each of these 20 folkways. Now, you are going to end up with some things that may not necessarily click initially. Now, a GM could just take those, throw some hand wavium at them, spackle over it, and keep going. Or the GM could say, okay, I got these two disparate things that don't seem to make any sense. Now, describe why the society has them at the same time. For example, the idea that there are people in America who profess to believe that life begins at conception, but they support the death penalty. That does not jibe well. But it exists. And you could have that kind of thing in your fantasy setting as well. Now, my only real critique of this product, I think, is it falls a little bit into the monoculture problem, which we see so much in science fiction and fantasy settings. I mean, TV, movies, novels, role-playing games. This is not just this product, but you see too many monocultures. If I were to use this Folkway product to describe America, and you could apply it to any culture you wanted to. You could do something broad like just say Scandinavian, or even broader, European, or you get very narrow, a specific country or a specific region of a country. So you could use this to create as many very unique settings as you want to. But if you were to say to describe America with this product and all the detail that this product affords you, that's not the world. We don't live on planet America. And presenting some of the races and the cultures that were being presented here, although the races at least, it really, to me, made them feel monoculture-like. Whereas I get the feeling from the theocracy that they have enemies that aren't like them, that the humans are afforded the luxury, the privilege of having multiple cultures, whereas a lot of the other races have a culture. And if you have a dozen human cultures, then to be realistic, you need a dozen cultures for every other race. Or more. Or have a really good reason why there's less than a dozen. Yes, that's a lot of work. And most people don't want to deal with it. And I completely and utterly understand that. But it does give a slanted view of the world in question, whether it's science fiction or fantasy, and regardless of what media it is being presented in. And that's probably my only real critique of this product, because to me it felt a little monocultural in some ways. But again, this product is tailor-made, so if you don't like the fact that one of these races really comes across as being monocultural, make a new culture for them. It's a lot of work, but you can still do it. And you could use this product to discover to give you a good handful of cultures for each of the races, so that someone can say, okay, I'm from X culture of this race. And because if you do that, then you could say, okay, these two cultures have a lot of interaction because they have very similar structures. So even though it's disparate species, they interact a lot. They have a lot of trade because they share the same cultural traits, which makes perfect sense and is completely logical. Whereas if you have, for example, the classic dwarves living under the earth and the classic elves living on the surface, they have zero interaction. There should be no antipathy between them. And there isn't in my games I run. So they're also not going to have a lot of contact, not a lot of trade. So you have to find a justification for them to know anything about each other, or be comfortable with the fact that they live in a world where they have completely different spheres of existence. That's up to you as the GM. But other than that critique, and it's a minor one, because again, it's rife in role-playing games. This is a solid product, absolutely solid. I'm really impressed with the level of research, the level of effort that was applied to this. When Colin offered me a copy of this, I told him that it was going to have a really hard time living up to some of the aspects of former HARP products, and it has. I like the fact that almost nothing in this has numbers attached to it. So this is almost completely gender neutral. I mean, not gender, completely product neutral. You could apply this to any fantasy setting, any science fiction setting. And the few places that they do discuss numbers, it's using a D100 system. And that's dead simple to apply to like a D20 system or any other system. The only one that might give you a slight bit of difficulty with is if you were doing something like Savage Worlds where they use dies, but you could figure that out without too much difficulty. Obviously, if they've got a really high bonus to X, then it means it's going to have a really high die, and you could figure out what you think those bonuses should be. But other than a mechanic like that, that's an issue with the mechanic itself. Any other system that uses numbers could be easily translated from a HARP product because it uses 100, and 100 is the most easy thing to translate to anything else there is. A whole lot better than like a range of 3 to 16, for example, 3 to 18, for example, or whether it's GURPS or D&D. Those are harder to translate than if you're using 100. But most of this product completely number free. You could use this anywhere, and the author actually addresses the fact that his intent was making it applicable to other games, which I loved. The fact that he was that forward thinking. So this is a solid product. I really liked it. I'm thinking you're going to really like it. I'm continuing to be impressed with HARP supplements. It's in many of the ways, like I've often been impressed with GURP supplements. Some of the supplements out there are so much better than the system, but here in HARP, the products are as good as the system, because I like HARP a whole lot more than GURPS. HARP solid. This product is solid, and I'm really glad I got a chance to look at it and do a review. So thank you, Colin, and thank you for helping to produce a product of this quality.